I used to think that it took a lot of land to be able to grow your own food, but I've learned that you can grow a lot of your own food in a smaller size property just by using different techniques. So I'm going to share with you that today, how to grow a lot of your own fruits and vegetables. The first lesson that I learned in growing my own food is you need to start before you even start growing your food, and the easiest way to do that is to eat seasonally. This is such a change, and I remember it being such a change when we started moving more towards this self-sufficient lifestyle. And that, I would love it if broccoli and tomatoes grew year-round in Florida. And I think some people think it does, but they don't. There's actually seasons. There's seasons for broccoli, there's seasons for tomatoes, there's seasons for sweet potatoes, there's seasons for every vegetable. There's really only one vegetable that I can think of right now that is grown and harvestable the entire year, and that's green onions. The rest of the fruits and the vegetables that we grow in our garden, they grow at a certain specific time. And so you can enjoy them fresh during that harvest season, but then once that harvest season is over, you have to move on either to eating them preserved, which we'll talk about a little bit later, or you need to move on to another vegetable that is growing. And that's typically what happens for me. Because I live in Florida, I do get to grow year round, but it does mean that different vegetables have different seasons. So during the winter, I'm growing broccoli, and I eat a ton of broccoli, so much so that I'm sick of it. But then, spring comes around, and then I'm eating a lot of onions and tomatoes and peppers. And then summer comes around, and I'm eating a lot of long beans and sweet potatoes. And then fall comes around, and I'm eating a lot of squash. So I have to change what I'm eating at different times of the year to make up for the fact that different vegetables are available at different times of the year. And hopefully we get enough of a harvest that I eat so much of it that I am sick of it and ready to move on to a different vegetable. The next step in growing your own food is to plan your garden space. I did a video probably 2 years ago on how much space you need to grow a garden for each person. I think it was about 150 square feet. This is a garden grown when you can grow year round. It's a much larger square footage if you have to grow during a shorter window, because you have to grow more food in a shorter window. So just keep that in mind. So there's a lot of different calculations that come into play. So how long is your growing season? I need less square footage because my growing season is long, but you might need more square footage if your growing season is very short. Then you have to think of whether you're growing in ground or you're growing in raised beds or maybe containers, vertical gardening. There's so many different ways to garden, so you have to take into account which way you're going to garden, because that will limit or allow for different kinds of methods of gardening, like growing vertically. Containers typically have a smaller productivity as opposed to in-ground or raised bed. Pole varieties and vining varieties typically have a higher productivity than bush style items. So all of those things go into figuring out your space and how you want to plan that space. If you can combine all of those elements and do some in ground, some vertical, some container, you're going to have the best of all worlds. Before we get to preserving these cucumbers, I wanted to give you a heads up. Make sure you get a copy of the Homegrown Florida Gardening Guide ebook. It will tell you everything you ever wanted to know about growing cucumbers, including all the different varieties that I've grown in my garden that have the best results here in Florida. Go to homegrownfloridagarden.com to pick up your copy today. I just harvested a bunch of cucumbers, and it kind of leads into our next topic here, which is grow what you eat. We love our cucumbers fresh, but we also adore pickles. So what you see me doing right here is actually preserving my harvest by using our cucumbers as pickles. There are some other ways that you can use them, like dehydrating them. I also like to freeze dry them to have like a cucumber powder for flavoring in tzatziki sauces. We're going to show you that later. But all these different ways all have to do with what you like to eat. If we didn't like cucumbers, if we didn't like pickles, if we didn't like tzatziki, there would be no point whatsoever in growing cucumbers. I know a lot of first-time gardeners who want to grow vegetables that maybe they don't eat because in their area they grow well, right? I know some gardeners that grow sweet potatoes every single year but don't eat sweet potatoes. So it doesn't always make sense to grow just because your area allows for it. Now, should you aim for that? Absolutely. Yes, you're going to have a lot less of a hard time if you are growing things that your area is known to grow for. But if you will not eat them, if you can't find a variety that you like, and you just know you're not going to eat them, there's no point in using your garden space. And we have to be using our garden space as productively as possible. Another thing to think about when you're growing food that you like to eat is also prioritizing the foods that cost the most in the grocery store. I just did a video on how to save money in the grocery store and what to grow and what to buy. So this is something to think about. Can you grow the food that costs the most? Are you going to be saving money? Maybe money isn't your focus. Maybe, eating more organically is your focus, or just supplying your own food is your focus. But there is a priority that you have to apply. And a lot of people, that's going to be financial. Like for example, tomatoes are very expensive in the grocery store, but they have a very high yield when you grow them at home. Herbs are very expensive in the grocery store, but they have a very high yield and an extremely low cost when you grow them at home. But if money is not your motivating factor, and perhaps it is healthy eating, what is the one thing that you eat a lot of in your house that you want to stop buying from the grocery store? And then maybe say it's broccoli. That would be us, right? We eat a ton of broccoli. So I am going to grow as much broccoli as I possibly can. And sometimes that means I'm not going to focus on, say, carrots or cabbage during that particular season. And instead I will buy those things because carrots and cabbage are very, very cheap. Even the organic stuff is very, very cheap. And I can source it. Maybe I can source it locally at the farmer's market, or maybe I can source it from a farmer nearby, as opposed to focusing on doing that for everything. I can focus just a little bit of my time at the broccoli. And once I get my handle on the broccoli and being able to grow a year's supply of broccoli, it's kind of like riding a bicycle. Once you've done it once, it becomes much easier to do in the subsequent years that you'll grow it. And then you can slowly start to add in those cabbages and start adding in those carrots. But you need to prioritize, because if you want to grow everything all at once, you're not going to be successful with everything all at once. It's much better to be very focused and driven and prioritize, and you'll be successful in that area. And then later on, you can bring on more and more vegetables and prioritize more and more vegetables as you become more successful in your garden. I want to pause for a second just so that I can give you guys a heads up of my recipe here that I use for my garlic dill pickled cucumbers or pickles. I start with 1 pint of white or distilled vinegar, 1 pint of water, 1 tablespoon of salt, and then what you see me putting in the jars here is some dried dill, some mustard seed, both of which I grew in my garden. I also added pickle crisp. This is something you can buy. It is totally optional. You do not have to use it, but it does help keep the cucumbers crisp. So I use 1/8 of a teaspoon of that, and then I'm going to put half a garlic clove into each one of my pints here. I am boiling the water, vinegar, salt mixture on the stove so that it can get hot, because this is a raw pack where we're going to pack in the cucumbers, and then we're going to pour the hot brine on top of it. We'll seal our jars with the lids and the bands, and I will water bath can them or put them in boiling water for 10 minutes. This is pretty much following the National Center for Home Food Preservation's pickle recipe, but it's adding the garlic, and I think it's adding some other of the seasoning and the pickle crisp. But this is part of their recipe. Once our timer goes off after the 10 minutes, I'm going to pull these out of the boiling water. I'm going to set them on the counter and I'm going to let them sit overnight to completely cool down and make sure that those lids sealed properly. Then the next day I come through, my hard water had a little bit of staining on the top of the lids. No big deal. This is typical in my area, but I'm going to pull those rings off and I'm going to test the lids just by hanging on to them, make sure that they are nice and sealed tight, and all of them did seal perfectly. The next step in growing your own food is to focus on high yield, low maintenance plants. And the highest yield, low maintenance plants that I can possibly think of or recommend is going to be perennial vegetables. This can also be herbs, so anything really perennial. So for us down here in Florida, it's going to really, in case I didn't mention this, it's going to depend on your area, so your zone, what is considered a perennial and what is not considered a perennial. So down here, sweet potatoes technically are a perennial for us, whereas in most of the rest of the country, they are not. Then you have things like pigeon peas. That's a perennial for us down here. For people up north, you might have rhubarb. You might have artichokes. There's asparagus for, all areas. There's a lot of different vegetables that you can grow that are going to come back year after year after year. Those focus on first, because if you can find an established place for them, preferably maybe not in your raised beds if you have raised beds, but somewhere in your yard or in your garden that's kind of off to the side, because they are going to need a place that can't have other vegetables mixed in. The cool thing about these vegetables is a lot of the times they need almost nothing from us. It's one of the things I love about them. So I usually fertilize my perennial vegetables once a year in spring when they come out of dormancy. But other than that, I do nothing. I don't prune them. I don't feed them the rest of the time. I'm not over there fussing with them. Typically when they're perennials, they don't really have a lot of bug infestations, especially if you're growing stuff that's designed and known for your area. They just hold up better. They don't need as much feeding. They don't need they're just really simple plants once you get them established. They're a little bit tough to get established in the beginning when they're young, but these are things like, for example, asparagus will grow for 30 years. This one plant that you spend one season getting into place will feed you and your family for 30 years, and you don't have to do much for them. It is so low maintenance. Now, moving on from perennial vegetables, there are low maintenance annual vegetables. So when I think of really low maintenance, it's really specific to the area that you're growing. In my area here in Florida, one of the lowest maintenance vegetables that I grow is sweet potatoes. Sweet potatoes kind of love our sandy soil. I don't fertilize our sweet potatoes. I don't prune the greens or anything like that. I really do nothing. I just kind of let them run wild, and then at the end of the season, I harvest them. Another one is going to be a Puerto Rican black bean. I love this one as well because it doesn't require fertilization. It's a direct seeded cowpea. It grows all through summer, protecting the soil, and then I harvest all of these black beans, and it's all of the black beans that we eat for a year. But it required almost nothing from me. I didn't even trellis them. They kind of just climb and go wild through the entire summer, and I just ignore them and they do their thing. No, I don't water any of these sweet potatoes or these Puerto Rican black beans during the summer. Our rain waters them. They are designed for our area here in Florida, so they do very well. This what makes them low maintenance. Now, your area, it probably is something else. It could be a different type of vegetable that grows very well that's not going to require a lot of input from you. Focus on those first, because if you can get the low maintenance, high yield through perennials or through these really specific plants that like to grow in your area, that's less work from you, higher reward. Then you can spend the rest of your time, that 80% of your time that's left over after you've gotten these guys established, and you can focus on those plants that maybe cost more, or maybe that you guys absolutely love and you have to really kind of fuss with them because maybe they don't particularly like your area or grow in your area quite as well. You can focus more of your time on that while knowing that these low maintenance crops are just doing their thing in the background. They are the stars of the garden, and they are just consistent over and over. In case you're curious what I'm doing here, I am attempting to shred these cucumbers into a small shred so that I can use them in tzatziki. Now you can make the tzatziki fresh, but what I'm doing is I'm shredding them so that way I can put them on my freeze dryer trays and freeze dry them to make tzatziki sauce later on. This is one way that I like to preserve my cucumbers other than pickling. But I'm having a rather difficult time using all of the different tools that I have, but it was well worth it because it did turn out very, very good. But once I'm done shredding them, all that I do to preserve this is lay them out on trays, freeze dry them. I think it was like 18 hours in the freeze dryer, and then it comes out and I just put them in glass jars, and they will last for years this way, and I can be using these by adding them as crispy cucumbers to salads, or I can add yogurt or sour cream to make a sauce. I also do the same process with zucchinis to save it for making zucchini bread, or save it to bulk up any kind of dinner that we're making. Like if we're making spaghettis, it's a great way to put some extra veggies into the meal by just adding some of the shredded vegetables to your sauce. I don't know if I necessarily do it with cucumbers. Cucumbers have a more extreme taste than I think zucchini does. But this is one of the ways that I like to preserve my cucumbers. Speaking of all the ways that I like to preserve my cucumbers, let's talk about preserving the excess. So when you are going to be growing your own food, one of the things you have to think about is if you're not growing year-round, or you want to save some of a harvest so that you can eat it later, you have to figure out ways to preserve the food. The biggest ways to preserve food is dehydrating, fermenting, water bath canning, pressure canning, and freeze drying. I think those are, and freezing. I almost forgot, of course, freezing. Right? These are all different ways, and they all have pros and cons, and they all have, preferences of whether you like to eat the food that way or not. Pickles is probably like a really common one. When it comes to cucumbers, a lot of people pickle their cucumbers, but fermenting is another option. Freeze drying is another option. Dehydrating is another option. There's a lot of ways of preserving your food, and you have to kind of test them out to see which ways you like the best, because there's no point in preserving the excess if you don't like to eat it in the way that you're preserving it. This is something that has taken me like a long time. I've been gardening for 10 years. I've been doing different preservation methods, and it has drove me nuts going into my pantry and looking at the same jar of canned greens that I made like 5 years ago and realizing that we just never eat them that way. We prefer them blanched and frozen. And then you take scoops and throw it in whatever you want. Stews, soups, pasta dishes, whatever. But canned greens, not my thing. I will never do them again. But I made like this huge batch of them. I had something like 20 jars the first time I made them. And I have learned since then that I always start, whenever I'm going to do a new preserving recipe like this one, for example, I am only going to make enough for one jar or a couple of jars, whatever I can get away with, to have the smallest recipe so that I can see if we're even going to use it that way. And I think that this is an important one to practice at, because if you find yourself, preserving and spending all this time preserving, because preserving takes a long time. You think growing takes a long time? Yeah, preserving takes a long time too. It's a lot of effort. It's a lot of work. And if you're not going to eat the food, it's such a bummer. And you can force yourself to eat it, but honestly, guys, we eat the food so that we, can sustain ourselves, but also so that we can enjoy it. And so you don't want to kind of have to force down eating stuff that you don't like. So definitely start smaller. If you see a recipe, say you had a great cucumber year and you see a great pickle recipe and you're like, oh, I'm going to can 20 cans of pickles, kind of hold off on that and just try your best and do like 1 jar or 2 jars and see if you like it first. Thanks so much for hanging out with me today. I hope this helped give you an idea of how to start growing some, if not all, of your own homegrown food. Make sure to get a copy of my Homegrown Florida Gardening Guide ebook. Happy gardening, guys!